Hello and welcome to Others of Havo. We are looking at Anna Karenina, and it is a book which is enormous and also, I would say, not that difficult. Really, the challenge is just the size and the amount of characters, but once that's overcome, this is a really enjoyable book. It is well structured, it's got characters that are compelling and really relatable. The context even doesn't seem to matter that much because the universality of the relationships and the conversations are really clear and enjoyable. The only issue with it, to me, is that it also kind of ruins the way they look at literary fiction. It has revealed such a core and archetypal narrative using marital infidelity as a way to reveal societal and structural errors and flaws that, I don't know, it's become a pattern, and it kind of puts me off literary fiction, at least for a little while. But we should talk about it. So, contextually, there's actually not that much to worry about for Anna Karenina. It's not really a book where you need to really read up on context before you can understand it. It is worthwhile to know what inventions were available at the time of its writing, and at the time, telegrams and trains were quite new and recent to the environment. So there are some moments where these are described in greater detail because of what they afford to the narrative and what they make possible that wasn't possible in the past. There's lots and lots of train journeys in this novel. And in addition to exploring what life is like with these technologies, we also see some minor conflicts about the old and the new, especially in terms of farming. And politically, what's happening in the world of this text, it is a contemporary text to the time that it was written, and it's exploring a period of Russian history. I'm massively summarizing here, and I'm not an expert by any means, but a period of history where there is a greater sense of personal responsibility and personal freedoms. There is a new ruler of Russia, and their attitude is to enable people to attain statuses of wealth and influence in society. So it's not one with really landed gentries and controlled dominions of power and families that have centuries of influence. Instead, it's one where individual success can matter, that people can move in society and can move upwards depending on their relationships or their jobs or their connections. It's one that is relatively optimistic, but also one where the stakes are high. It's not one where characters feel beaten down into the roles that they've been designed. It's one where characters are starting to try and define themselves and see what role will they play in the future of their country, in addition to the future of their lives. Leo Tolstoy himself wrote this novel in a serialized manner, and in a way I kind of wish that I was there to read this in a serialized form. I think just being able to talk about it piece by piece as it comes out would have been a more enjoyable experience than just reading it all in one hit. And there's not really much to add to this conversation about Anna Karenina. It's an old book, and people talked about it to the ends of the earth. I just wanted to put in my own reflections and see how things go. And we'll just briefly do a chapter summary, usual things. So today I finished part 1 of Anna Karenina. It has been, to be honest, quite enjoyable. So I knew this wasn't going to be as hard as some of the other things I've read so far, just that it's quite long. And I did have a general understanding of what the plot's going to be. So far the reading process has been quite smooth. I really appreciated having the list of names. So there's a giant list of names at the very beginning, which is 4 or 5 pages long. There's lots of characters in here, but I really do appreciate how it tells me how to pronounce them, and it also tells me who's connected to who, but it doesn't go any much more beyond that, so we don't know any plot details, which is nice. And it's been really fun reading Tolstoy's descriptions of characters just to try and get to know everybody and to see what their values are and how they react to situations. I'm getting back into the rhythm of reading the Russian epics and remembering what it's like to read Omniscient and to be in this kind of big, heavy, top-down, hear everybody's thoughts kind of style of writing, where I think if the author isn't extremely detail-oriented, sometimes it can come off as a bit disingenuous, but I'm not feeling that with Tolstoy. With Tolstoy, I feel like all the details that he's given are very prudent and very believable. The characters are well constructed, and I understand their motivations very clearly. I really like Levin, although he's kind of like a figure to make fun of, and sometimes you do kind of laugh at him so far. I do like just the way the novel treats him and how his reactions are quite stark, but it's like a heightened demonstration of what an ordinary human being might feel in a certain circumstance. So I'm kind of curious to see where that goes. Aside from that, I think the plotting and the pacing has been really quite good. Each chapter is really short, it's easy to get through, and the scope is well done as well, so I don't find that there's too many scenes that have lots of characters and it's really slowed down and hard to follow. I'm just enjoying it so far, so I'm keen to see where this goes. That's been part one. We've met all the main characters. We've met Anna and Vronsky, and we kind of understand their initial first meeting and their burgeoning desire for one another. We've also met the various families, so the Shabatskys and oh no, I've forgotten the name already, but the main family of Oblonsky and Dolly. I'm just trying to get around all these names, but I'm enjoying it so far. I can remember what all the character connections are, and everything's just nice. It's very quaint. It's this domestic drama. I get that stakes are going to get higher later, but I'm just enjoying it for what it is so far. Okay, so I've just finished part 2 today, and I'm really enjoying it. I'm quite into it. I think the characters are so far so well defined, and it's just really easy to understand what their motivations are. I also think that for a book this long, the pacing is really quite fantastic. The scenes are well divvied up. We get a few very short chapters in one space, and then we move to another space. We had an interesting moment in part 2 with a horse race where Vronsky is a jockey in a steeplechase, and we have Anna watching him with the rest of her family. And so we had that one scene from 2 different angles, and I thought it was quite interesting to see how that would play out. I like the complexity of that, but I also like just the little moments as well. There's quiet moments with Levin in the countryside, and it's just enjoyable. All of it's well balanced. There's characters that feel emotions very strongly, and there's characters that are a bit more stoic. We see this full spread of human behavior, and we move between them in a really meaningful way so that we never get too stressed out with any one individual person. It's just good, it's fun. So it's been, I think, 6 days of reading it now. I started this on Saturday, today is now Wednesday. 5 days, goodness. I'm getting through it really fast. I'm reading almost 100 pages a day, just on the train. And I don't really want to stop. It's almost November, and when November starts, I do want to start doing my books of the month. I might put this in the back burner for a bit, but I don't want to. I actually just want to keep going and seeing if I can finish this in 2 weeks or so. I'm definitely on track to. I don't know if it's going to slow down or anything, but really from these first 2 parts, it's really strong and I'm enjoying it a lot. Okay, so it is now November, and I've finished part 3 of Anna Karenina. I do start to see it slowing down a little bit now. The attention is moving away from Anna and Karenin. It's focusing quite a bit on Levin this chapter, and it's about his attitudes towards farming and labor and countryside reform, which I find tremendously interesting. I think I'm probably in the minority here of people who pick up this book for the romance drama plot, but I think that Levin's subplot is such an interesting counterpart to it, because in this section, Levin meets a very conservative, aristocratic member of Russian society and has this debate about who deserves to have power and how do we treat the working class. I just find that really fascinating from a book from the 1800s, foreshadowing a lot of the conversations that we would eventually have in the 1900s and even today about how we treat people in various classes of society and how working sometimes is a delightful thing. The descriptions of Levin mowing and tilling the land are quite pleasant, and I really like that as a palate cleanser from the more tumultuous relationship moments between Anna and Karenin. I think that because the book is so long, it can go on these tangents, and I'm not that mad, especially because the romance chapters are quite dramatic and I need a palate cleanser from it sometimes. So I'm enjoying it so far, and I'm very interested in how these things are going to combine and unite and develop as the book goes on. I've read almost half of it now. It's about the length of 2 novels that I've read into it. I would say the full thing, 390,000 words, about 4 novels long. I'm enjoying it. I'm really liking it. And I wish I didn't have to pause, but I do also want to get stuck into my books of November, so we'll see if I can read a book in between, and then come back to this, see how we go. Okay, some time has passed, but I'm finished with part 4, and that means I'm more than halfway through this book. Wow. Part 4, everyone's so dramatic in part 4. Goodness, so much is happening. So, Karenin decides to divorce his wife, and he goes to the lawyer, and they have this big song and dance about it. And in the meantime, Levin and Kitty get together, and they both realize they like each other, and this kind of puts a wall in Levin's whole agrarian, back to nature kind of lifestyle, because now he's just absolutely madly in love. Meanwhile, Karenin, while he's getting his divorce, gets a message from his wife to say that Anna is very sick, and Karenin rushes back home and immediately forgives Anna for cheating, and suddenly their relationship is completely reconciled. Vronsky, hearing about this and finding out about this, he's also trying to be with Anna while she's really sick, but Vronsky, being the dramatic man that he is, that everyone is in this section, goes home and shoots himself, and he survives. But this creates even more drama because Anna also gets better, and so now we have all these characters in serious flux. We have Karenin, who was previously going to divorce his wife and now decided not to, forgiven his wife, but the level of kind of understanding and acceptance between Karenin and Anna right now is in a really bad state. Meanwhile, Vronsky is still recovering, and Kitty and Levin seem like they're about to be in a healthy relationship. For this book, I am very surprised and optimistic. I feel like it's actually pretty funny. There's all these little fake outs where it seems like Levin and Kitty are not going to work out, but then they just talk to each other and resolve their problems. Communication, right? It's completely unheard of. But so far, enjoying it. The pacing is still incredible. So much is going on. It's still very easy to follow. Yeah, it's been really, really good. And I've been fitting a few November books in between the Anna Karenina sections. Things are good. Things are getting through it. I should probably have this done by the end of November at the very latest, I think. Okay, part 5, and whoops, it's been a week and I accidentally finished the whole thing. So these next few parts are being recorded with knowledge of how future parts go, and that I feel like kind of helps as well. So in part 5, we have Levin getting married to Kitty, and this is something that's been building up for the last couple of parts. Levin, thanks to his experiences in the farm and kind of swallowing his feelings, is a fairly normal dude, and Kitty, due to her experience of heartbreak, is also pretty normal. And so what's so interesting about part 5 after this wedding sequence is that you keep thinking things are going to go wrong, and they just don't really. Like, after conflicts arise, they just manage to talk to each other and hash it out, and they're both very easy and eager to forgive one another, which is a great contrast from everybody else in the story. And so in part 5, the other thing that happens is Anna and Vronsky go and travel around Europe and try to escape kind of the gossip of Russia. And they end up getting a painting commissioned of Anna, which is... It's a really lengthy passage, and there's a lot of discussion here about the nature of art and the role of portraiture, which I kind of wonder how significant that is. The painting does come up later in the text, briefly, but there's a lot of talk about that. And in doing so, they discuss Anna and her image and the idea of how she has a really hard time just being satisfied. So across these next few parts, we're going to get a lot of conflict about how Anna, despite receiving this relationship with Vronsky that she's been desiring for so far up until this point, there are going to be things that hold her back. Another weird thing too is that when Levin is getting married to Kitty, he's not religious, and so he has issues with going through the very traditional Christian ceremony that the wedding is. That's about all that happens in this part. Part number 6, so a new character gets introduced named Varenka Volosky, and he's interesting because he's an eligible bachelor, and he kind of worms his way into the main couples and groups, and we see how different pairs are contrasted with their attitude towards Volosky. So he initially is speaking quite flirtatiously with Kitty, and Levin starts to have this feeling of jealousy, but he's able to swallow it down. Whereas when Volosky then goes to Anna and Vronsky, Anna's reaction to Volosky is very different, and she kind of uses him as a test to see if she's still able to kind of capture the hearts of young men, which raises alarm bells for the status of her relationship with Vronsky, which, as this is going, is not good. So at this point, Anna's first son with Alexei Karenin, in this edition is his name Sereza. Anna treats Sereza as her only true child, despite the fact that Anna has her own child, or has a child with Vronsky as well, Annie. Annie barely gets mentioned, and Anna just really, really wants Sereza back in her life. Unfortunately, Alexei Karenin has custody of Sereza and is training him up in this really strict method, and he's also kind of training him up to forget Anna. We get this in the omniscient narration, and there's Countess Lydia, who's now become the confidant to Alexei, is enforcing this as well. So Anna very desperately wants to get her son back, but at the same time, she wants Vronsky to Vronsky wants Anna to get a divorce from Alexei, so then they can properly be a couple. And they also want, Vronsky also wants a additional child as part of his legacy. Vronsky is now, at this point, very unhappy that he's not going to have an heir, because Anna doesn't seem to be treating his DNA child as well as she's pining after her own child. Things just looking bad, but it's not building towards this really big climax. Instead, it's this really slow burn conflict of seeing these two characters that just really, really can't see eye to eye. Part number 7 is a little bit weird. It starts with this political segment where Vronsky and Levin and a bunch of other significant characters are at this political conference, and they're discussing with some new characters that we've just been introduced about governance and economics and the management of land investments, discussing what is right for the future of Russia. And this bit to me was a little bit dry, and I think I didn't get the full historical context to understand why it was really significant. But I found it really interesting to have these characters whose identities so far I've come to learn and understand from their relationships with women, and seeing how their various personalities now work within the political sphere. So how they try to get what they want and how they try to justify their worldview and their values. That is interesting, that I think maybe on a second read I can get more of, because I do think there are some very high-minded political things that are trying to be said in this chapter and also across the full text. And it's a bit dry, I will admit, but I did get through it. And then midway through part 7, Levin has a kid. Kitty gives birth to Levin's child in this surprise moment, and Levin's kind of shook by this because it's not this powerful emotional moment that he assumes it's going to be, and he has this big crisis of faith and purpose, trying to figure out really what is the purpose of life and what does all of this mean. While this is happening, Anna is having a parallel, very similar crisis about how can she find joy in life anymore now that all of these discussions have kind of petered out. So Alexei has refused to allow Anna to have a divorce, and Vronsky, she can't seem to derive love from Vronsky in a way that she derives love from other people. So now that she's met, in part 7, she also meets Levin, and she has that same kind of mystifying effect on Levin that she has on everyone that she meets. And she's distraught because she can't seem to have this effect on Vronsky anymore. And so the famous part of this novel's plot, the thing that I knew about it right before reading this, is that Anna commits suicide by jumping in front of a train, and this happens at the end of this section. So the feeling of despair that gets her to this point is very powerful, but it only is so because of the dozens of chapters in the lead to this where Anna's relationship with Vronsky is very toxic and very constraining, but reverberating through that is the idea that she's had the same problems with Alexei, her first husband, and she's kind of identified things within her relationships to others that are irreconcilable. And so this creates this enormous feeling of despair. She decides to commit suicide basically as an act of revenge against Vronsky in order to leave him with this curse that he can never really get rid of. And I don't really like that, because, and I'll talk about this more in the analysis, but it's not so much Anna taking any sense of control of her own life, in a sense. I hate to say this because there are so many novels along the same lines of women in poor relationship situations that take control of their own narrative through the act of suicide. Like, I'm thinking about The Awakening, and I'm thinking about The Bell Jar, and I'm thinking about so many different works of feminist literature, and this book doesn't really fall into that pattern very much, because I feel like, despite the fact that it's named after Anna Karenina, the fact that we do have lots of female characters that give them a lot of depth, it's mostly a novel about men, and the women are kind of a tool to reveal the different attitudes of the men. I feel like this is what I'm getting out of this reading so far. But that is part 7. It ends with Anna's death. And part number 8, and finishing this book, it gets stranger, I found. So part number 8 starts with the aftermath. Well, not really the aftermath. It jumps forward a couple of weeks in time where we find out the aftermath of what happened after Anna's death. Vronsky, well, actually there's a war going on, just very coincidentally, and a lot of characters mention it. Fortunately for Vronsky is able to just pour all his efforts into fighting this war as a volunteer, and a lot of the other characters go as well. And by doing so, he's able to ignore the kinds of relationship failures that he had with Anna. Meanwhile, as this is happening, Levin has this moment of divine realization where he comes to faith, and he spends all this time on his farm pondering his purpose of life and how his discovery of Christianity reshapes his worldview and reshapes everything. There's this really poignant moment where he's rushing home in this giant storm, and Kitty and his child are caught in the rain, and Levin kind of goes up to them and starts chastising them and going, how dangerous is this? But then he's overwhelmed with love for them. And Levin, in this character so far, is the one that seems to have solved all the problems that arise. So looking at Oblonsky and looking at Vronsky and all the other characters that don't seem to have fulfilling relationships with women, Levin is the character who seemingly has solved that. He's figured out how to forgive others, and he's figured out how to be forgiven, and this aligns with his spiritual discovery and awakening towards the end as well. It is a somewhat uplifting ending. It leaves a lot of questions open, and a lot of those big spiritual, theological questions, this book doesn't try to answer. Instead, it shows Levin as a very young Christian trying to figure out what that means, but not really able to, and only able to acknowledge that the spiritual experience that he's had is real. But it's an uplifting end in contrast to the quite dour ending of Anna. I don't really know how to feel about that. I think it's fine. I think it's interesting. I think if you don't like Levin as a character, I think midway through reading this, I was reading some reviews and read-alongs and seeing what other people thought, and some people didn't really like Levin as a character, and I can understand why that's the case. If you don't like Levin, this is not a great ending for you. I did really like Levin, and I still don't know if I'm super satisfied with this ending. I think that Anna, despite being this incredibly powerful and magnetic character, doesn't really even get mentioned in part 8. Like, it's very much not a book about her, despite her being the title character. It's a book about the people that she has an impact on. And they kind of have their own arcs, and part 8 wraps all of that up, and everything's kind of fine. I'm not fully satisfied by this ending, but I also feel really glad to have read the whole thing. I think the process of reading this, and that feeling across maybe chapters or parts 2 to 7, of being held in this feeling of being trapped and unable to communicate, that is what's so powerful about this novel. So I'm very glad to have read it. Would I give it a rating? I would give it a 4 out of 5. Many good things to be learned here, but also very long, and not everything is relevant. Like, it's not really a poster child for constrained and elegant storytelling, but I also don't know how I would take anything out. Like, everything kind of fits all in one. So there's 3 themes that I mainly want to talk about when finishing this book. The first, and the one that I thought about a lot, is the representation of masculinity and femininity. And despite being a book named after a woman and featuring a female lead as the main character, it seems like a book written by a man about men for men. Like, it really is quite a masculine text, because the men in this text get the most psychological complexity and narrative complexity. I feel like what this novel says about what it means to be a man is that it means to balance all the various influences and responsibilities that one has in life, the responsibility that one has to their family and the one they have towards their job, their individual sense of self, their sense of power and agency over their surroundings, and the expectations that society places on them and whether or not they meet those. Those are really interesting things, and those are explored really fantastically in all of these male characters. So Oblonsky is dealing with this idea of fidelity, despite him being this really influential figure who gives advice everywhere he goes and is so personable and everyone loves him. Him trying to maintain this feeling of normalcy in his relationship after he's cheated, compared with Vronsky, who's a very powerful individual and who wants to attain higher ranks and to work his way up in society, but the limitations placed on him by his relationship that he enters into with Anna, that weighs in on him. And lastly, with Levin and his feelings of power in farming and his own personal sense of independence being at first constrained by his inability to form a relationship with Kitty, and then later on his learning to be more accepting and be more open-minded now that Kitty is there to help him. I feel like these narrative arcs are what I would call the core arcs of the novel, because they are the ones where we see change and we see exploration for these characters, and I find very intriguing to read. By contrast, I feel like most of the female characters are kind of there as tools to show this character development for the men. So Kitty and Anna would be, I would say, the main female characters. We do get representations of Daria and the princess and other women as well, but the main ones I'd say are Kitty and Anna. Anna is so constant in her character. She is so defined by her passion and her need for sensation, and she doesn't really change very much. I don't feel like this novel is one that explores how the experiences she goes through affects change in some way. Instead, it's more of a tragic story about how her essence, how her core qualities lead to ruin. And so it's not quite as compelling because there are complex character arcs happening just kind of around her. And with Kitty, I think Kitty is a much more interesting character arc. It's kind of a coming-of-age story for her, because at first she's this young woman who's dreaming of a longer-term relationship, and then as she takes that role, she takes on responsibility, and she becomes quite a likable character. But there isn't a lot of development needed to get to that stage. Actually, what I find her arc is doing is it's a foil and a contrast to Levin's arc, because Levin needs to spend a lot of time learning about what it means to be in a relationship. He needs to learn to rely on others, and he needs to learn that his independence, while a good thing sometimes, will cloud his judgment and prevent him from seeing the blessings that he receives from marrying Kitty. Whereas Kitty just kind of is great when she's married. Kitty's just fantastic at speaking to Levin's family and fantastic at managing the children and everything. So the arc to me is just not as strong. Like, even when the woman question is a thing that the novel explicitly raises, it does give psychological complexity to an extent to Anna and Kitty, but just not as much as I would want. Just compared to novels that came afterwards, compared to novels today, the way that it represents women is just not really up to par. So I was hopeful, but I wouldn't say this is one of the better things about this text. It's one of the things I say would probably limit people's enjoyment of the text today. This is a bit of a cheeky edit, because as I was editing the video and a day later, I started realizing why I felt this way about the men and the women of the text, and I think I feel more sympathetic towards both Tolstoy himself and the women of the culture that he's writing about, because I thought a lot about how masculinity in this text is about different spheres and dimensions of society, and what a lot of the men tend to do when they have romantic failures is to just dive headfirst into something else. Like Levin goes into farming, Vronsky goes to politics, and eventually goes into the war as well. Oblonsky goes into social interactions and schmoozing with people. Different pursuits in society are afforded to the men, but it didn't hit me until I thought about it more, that actually none of these spheres were open to the women. And so when Anna and Kitty and Daria, for that reason, had issues with their marriages and their families, they couldn't do what the men did to try and get their mind off things, right? And I found that that links very much to the novel's themes of the women question, leading to even women's opinions in politics, is that when there's this big of a lack of spheres for women to participate within society, then of course any kind of domestic turmoil is going to be much more tumultuous and create so much more anguish for women than for men. It makes a lot more sense why Anna feels trapped, having thought about it in these terms, because Vronsky is not trapped. Like, Vronsky and all the other men can leave the world of domesticity and not be controlled by the women in their life. Whereas the women in this text can't leave that world of domesticity. They, no matter what they end up doing, they do have to be controlled in some extent, whether it's Anna going traveling but she has to be with Vronsky, or it's Anna desiring to go into motherhood and focus her attentions on Cereza, but that's also controlled by Alexei Karenin. Actually, I can't believe I didn't notice this earlier, right? I think it makes so much more sense in this sense, and this novel does feel more feminist or proto-feminist in these terms. The issue is that the women are the one who's getting punished at the end of the text, and the men kind of, I don't want to say they go off scot-free, but they are the ones that have the big character changes and moments. In this lens, the novel feels more critical towards societal patriarchies, and so I think it is worthwhile to read with that in mind. But it's hard to talk about this. It's not as if Tolstoy could really have gone against and totally transcended the values of his time. He's working within the values of his time, and it is showing the tragedy of when societies are so limiting to women in a way that they aren't to men. I think this does iron things out a bit, but it also still reinforces the fact that I do want to go back to reading more things from my time. And the next theme I want to talk about is the way this novel falls into a much larger scope and sequence of novels that feature marital infidelity as a means to show societal flaws and societal decay. Like, having read this text, and it works, right? The way that it does it, it works. It shows the way that the relationship breakdowns, whether it is Levin and Kitty, or Anna and Vronsky, or Alexei Karenin, and all of the characters, it shows how their ability or inability to manage their relationship and home life affects the way that they manage their political and economic lives, and it shows largely the moral and social underpinnings of society in Russia. Like, it works pretty well. I feel like I've learned a lot about people and society through reading this. But it reveals to me that a lot of literature fiction does this. Like, if I flick onto the screen, like, all these different texts that fall into the same category, and especially going into the modernist era, it's just quite a common narrative. And it is one that works, and it's one that does feel different every time you change the context a little bit. And it can be used and adapted to different societies, of course, but it's just getting a bit wearisome to me, you know? Like, I've seen this kind of story before, and that's how I felt when reading this, is that it's a long and dense story, but it's one that I've seen before, and I've seen it in France, and I've seen it in England, and I see it all across Europe. I see it in Germany. I see it just... It's fine, it works, but I'm ready for something different, you know? This is where I'm at. I feel like I've read a lot of literary fiction, and I see people getting inspired by Anna Karenina. I just want something different. And the last thing I want to talk about, this one's a bit more on the craft side of things. So a lot of the classic Russian fiction uses third-person omniscient perspective, and this one does as well. This one, it uses it in a way that's a bit different to what I've expected from Dostoevsky and from Gogol. Tolstoy is more of a dramatist in the sense that he's not going to tell us every single character's thoughts and feelings, and he's going to pick moments where he's actually going to show characters not understanding one another, or just successfully understanding one another as well. But we're not going to get every character's thought all the time in every scene. He's just going to direct us into the heads of the characters that he cares about in that particular moment. And it shows a real testament to the skill of the author that I never at any point reading this thought, oh, I wish I knew what this character was thinking right now. Because I could either understand it or I could recognize that that wasn't the focus of this scene. In any given scene, we are in the perspective of the character that we care the most about or are having the biggest psychological moment. And so I think it kind of works. I think it just flows really naturally, and it makes me curious about how much work went into planning and mapping it all out, because third-person omniscient can fail so easily. I think there's so many different ways that it can not present to the audience what the author wants it to do, because it's so unnatural of a perspective. Like, we never have really that experience of omniscience in our own lives. We'll never know every side of the conversation. We'll never know what someone else is thinking. And so for a author to choose this angle, it's a real challenge, because they need to prove to the audience that they know. They know not just what their character, the protective character, is thinking, but every character in the text. They know what they're thinking, and they can accurately represent that, both in terms of their internal thoughts and their external actions. I think Tolstoy does pretty well. I think that most characters get good complexity, and I think that the men in particular get really good complexity. I think the women, I just feel a bit lacking in the representation of Anna. I think that Anna doesn't always feel real. Anna sometimes feels like a mythical creature because of the magical way that she has influence over all men. It just seems like something that is pushed further for a narrative point, rather than something that's trying to capture the essence of a real human being. That's just kind of my thought, right? Like, a lot of the men feel like they're trying to be realistic humans, and Anna, in all of this, stands out. That's what I'd say about her character, is that she stands apart from the other characters because of the intensity of her desire, and because of the power of her effect on people around her that no one else really seems to have. I think also it's interesting to see how miscommunication works in terms of this narrative. There is a lot, but it's not done for really comedic or dramatic purposes. It's done to show that people can never truly understand one another, and it becomes the core experience of the text, not the conflict, because I wouldn't say that this is a text that builds towards a big climax. Instead, it's a text that holds the reader in this feeling of suspension. And a lot of that has to do with miscommunication. The fact that the reader, through the omniscient perspective, can see what all the characters feel and see what they're all going through. And the characters themselves sometimes are beyond that understanding. They don't know why somebody else is thinking a certain way or why they've acted a certain way. We then feel this feeling of longing and tension because we see the problems within relationships. And we simultaneously can judge the characters for failing, but also have empathy for them and think that if we were in their situation, we would probably make the same mistake. It is a very open and sobering look at the way that our communications can sometimes break down, and I really like the way that conflict develops from this, because even though there's dramatic moments, there's not really any one moment that I feel particularly contrived for the text. I feel like it really is the consequence of real human beings failing to understand other real human beings because of the way that humanity works, with Anna as this big, powerful catalyst, as also a person in her own right, but just not the same kind of person that other people are. People are dancing around Anna, and Anna is going to be bold and a hurricane and affecting everyone around her. So that's Anna Karenina. I don't want to say anything more about it because I feel like it's just a decent, straightforward text. Like, it's just all its cards on the table, no surprises, no challenges. It's just long. That's it. If you can get over length, then there is a very enjoyable book to be found here, and there's an interesting experience and an interesting discussion to be had about all of this. So I come to it with my assumptions, my biases, and I leave it with, in some ways, challenged attitudes towards relationships, and in other ways kind of reinforced things that I already think about literary fiction. I would recommend it. I think it's a worthwhile text to read, and it's one that is rewarding if you can take the time to stick with the characters and learn who they are and see how they grow and change. it's not, well, of course not perfect, but it's not entirely good. Isn't that a weird thing to say? It's not something that I entirely stand by, and I hopefully have properly expressed my reservations and flaws regarding it. I think craft-wise, it's an excellent text. Maybe could have been trimmed a little bit, but who's playing home, right? I actually have a spirited defense for the farming segment because I think they're really relevant, and they show the character of Eleven really well because we need to know him outside of his romantic desire for Kitty. I'm going on a digression here. It's fine. It's pretty good. I recommend it. It's pretty good. Alright, this is the last time I'm spinning this wheel for the year. This could be a mistake. I don't really know how it's going to go. As I'm looking at this, I realize I'm not taking War and Peace off. I don't think I'm going to read all of War and Peace in December. So we'll just see. It's a 1 in 10 chance, but I do want to get one last difficult set of books ready to do. So let's give it a go. You know what? This is actually what I really wanted anyway. So the Faulkner duology is, well, I've used this term to refer to The Sound and the Fury and Absalom. Those are 2 books that I bought a very long time ago and then have not been able to read because William Faulkner is a difficult man. But I even already have this out because I was actually hoping that this would come up. This is fantastic. So we're talking about these 2 books, The Sound and the Fury and Absalom. I have these editions that I'm really happy with because they look really gorgeous. That being said, they are some of the most difficult books that I remember trying to read. I've tried to read each of these and I've failed each multiple times. I was prescribed Absalom at uni actually, and I got through like 150 pages before realizing that I didn't understand a single thing that I read, so I kind of threw it away and set it aside. And I treated William Faulkner as my nemesis for the last almost 10 years now. Gosh, it's been a long time since uni. But I kind of assumed that I would never be able to understand him. And now here we are, we're doing our final boss books, we're doing the books that we thought, or I thought, that I would never finish at any point in my life. And so these 2, what better time than now to tackle them both. The Sound of the Fury is a little bit shorter. I don't really know what it's about, but I know it is a stream of consciousness, multi-perspective book about a dysfunctional family. It was written in the 1920s, I believe, or set in the, maybe 1930s, but it's set in the 1920s. I flipped to a random page, and there's a drawing of an eye here. I don't know. It is 272 pages, though, so hopefully this one's not too hard to get through. I can't believe it. There is a voucher for Strike Bowling that I was using as the bookmark for this, and it expired valid through 30th of June 2016. Oh my goodness. First line. So, where is that? April 7th, 1928. Through the fence between the curling flower spaces, I could see them hitting. They were coming toward where the flag was, and I went along the fence. Luster was hunting in the grass by the flower tree. They took the flag out, and they were hitting. Then they put the flag back, and they went to the table, and he hit, and the other hit. Then they went on, and I went along the fence. Luster came away from the flower tree, and we went along the fence, and they stopped, and we stopped, and I looked through the fence while Luster was hunting in the grass. What does that mean? I don't understand. Okay, so hopefully at some point I will come to an understanding and we will do updates as I finish each novel, I guess. We'll see. Thank you for watching.